My son stood at the head of the dinner table on the night of my 68th birthday and told me I would be moving into the room above the garage. I remember setting my fork down very slowly, the way I used to when I needed a moment before I spoke. Nobody at that table looked at me. My daughter-in-law, Jenna, was already scrolling through paint swatches on her phone for what she called the new nursery. My grandson, Tyler, kept eating his cake like nothing had been said at all. It was my son, Mark, who finally met my eyes, and even he looked away first. "It's just temporary, Dad," he said, "just until we figure things out." I had built that house with my own hands 31 years earlier. I had carried my wife, Eleanor, over its threshold. I had taught Mark to ride a bicycle in its driveway. And now I was being told, over a birthday cake with 68 candles I hadn't asked for, that there was no longer room for me in it. I said, "All right." That was all. I have never been a man who raises his voice, and I wasn't going to start that night. But something in me went very quiet and very still, the way a lake goes still before a storm crosses it. To understand how I ended up at that table, you have to understand who I used to be, before grief made me small in their eyes. I started as a stock boy at a hardware store on Route 9 when I was 19. By the time I was 30, I owned that store. By the time I was 50, I owned 12 of them across 3 counties, along with the warehouses that supplied them. 12 years ago, I sold the majority of the company to a larger regional chain. It was, by any reasonable measure, a great deal of money. I kept a smaller share of the company, along with the land under 4 of the warehouses, which I still leased out quietly every month. Almost nobody outside my accountant and my lawyer knew any of this, because Eleanor asked me not to tell the children. "Let them love you for who you are, not for what you have," she used to say. After she passed away 2 years ago, I kept that promise, mostly because keeping it felt like keeping her close. I drove my old truck. I wore the same 3 flannel shirts in rotation. I never once corrected anyone who assumed a retired hardware store worker. I did not know then that Eleanor's small request would eventually become the very thing that showed me exactly who my family had become. It started slowly, the way most disrespect does. Small comments at first. Mark mentioning that Dad doesn't really need much anymore. Jenna suggesting, in front of me, that I probably wouldn't understand, a financial decision they were making about the house. Tyler stopped asking me to his baseball games because, as I overheard him tell a friend on the phone, "My grandpa's kind of embarrassing. He drives this old rusty truck." I said nothing. I have buried a wife. I have buried both of my parents. I have learned that silence, when chosen deliberately, is not weakness. It is a place to stand while you watch. I kept making myself useful, the way I always had. I fixed the leak under the kitchen sink before Mark even noticed it was dripping. I cooked Sunday dinners because Jenna said she was too exhausted from work most weekends. When her car went into the shop for a week, I drove Tyler to school every morning in my old truck, waking up an hour earlier than I needed to so he wouldn't be late. Not one of those mornings ended with a thank you. On the 3rd day, as I pulled up near the school gate, Tyler asked me, without quite looking at me, if I could drop him off around the corner instead of right at the entrance, just so it's easier for you to turn around. I understood exactly what he meant, and I did it anyway, because I loved him more than I needed him to say something kind to me. 3 weeks after my birthday, Mark sat me down in the kitchen with a folder of brochures. Sunny Pines Senior Residence, 40 minutes outside of town, a squat beige building with a parking lot instead of a garden. "It's a really nice place, Dad," he said. "They have bingo on Tuesdays." "I have a home," I said. "We need the space," Jenna said, not looking up from folding laundry. "And honestly, it would probably be good for you. More people your age to talk to." I looked at my son, and I asked him plainly, "Is this about space, Mark? Or is this about money?" He hesitated just long enough for me to know the answer. "We're just trying to plan ahead," he said. "You're getting older. We don't know what kind of care you'll need. And well, we don't exactly have room in the budget for surprises." I nodded slowly. I had $4 million sitting in a diversified portfolio my lawyer managed, and my own son was worried about affording my old age. I did not tell him that. Eleanor's voice was still in my ear. "Watch them, Robert. Let their hearts show you who they are before you show them what you have." The following month, they went to Florida for a family vacation. Nobody mentioned it to me until Tyler posted photographs from the beach. When I asked Mark about it later, he said, "We figured you wouldn't want to spend the money on a flight." That same week, we went out to a restaurant for Jenna's birthday, and when the check came, Mark slid it toward me without a word, the way you'd slide a bill toward the person expected to pay it, out of habit rather than respect. I paid it, as I always did, without complaint. But Jenna leaned over to her sister who was visiting and said, just loud enough for me to hear, "He acts like paying for dinner makes him some kind of hero. It's $50, not a mortgage." I excused myself to the restroom and stood at the sink for a long moment, looking at an old man in the mirror who had built an empire out of nails and lumber, and had somehow become, in his own family's eyes, a burden who couldn't be trusted with $50. A few days after that dinner, Mark came to me with a folder of his own, one that had nothing to do with senior residences. Inside was a power of attorney document, drafted by a lawyer I had never heard of. "It's just a precaution, Dad," he said, sliding it across the table like the restaurant bill. "If anything ever happens to you, medically or financially, someone needs to be able to make decisions fast. It would be me, obviously." I read through it slowly, the way I used to read supplier contracts, and I noticed it gave him full authority over any accounts, properties, or assets in my name, not just medical decisions. I told him I wasn't ready to sign anything like that yet, and I watched something tighten in his jaw, the particular disappointment of a man who had expected an easier yes. 2 weeks later, something happened that cracked the silence open, just slightly. My phone rang while I was fixing the garden fence, and a man introduced himself as an attorney representing the Callahan Building Supply Trust, my trust, though of course my family didn't know that name meant anything. He asked to confirm a wire transfer for my quarterly distribution. I stepped away from the fence to take the call properly, and when I turned around, Tyler was standing in the doorway, staring at me with a confused expression. "Who was that?" he asked. "You said something about a trust." "Just old business," I told him, and he shrugged and went back inside. the way 13-year-olds do when nothing seems interesting enough to hold their attention. But I noticed he mentioned it to his mother that evening, because Jenna gave me a strange, searching look over dinner that I hadn't seen from her in a long time. A week after that, an old friend and former business partner, Daniel Reyes, showed up unannounced at the house with a bottle of wine, laughing before he even got through the door. "Mr. Chairman," he said, clapping me on the shoulder in front of my entire family. "I still can't get used to calling you that instead of boss. The board meeting isn't until Thursday, but I wanted to catch up before then." The kitchen went silent. Mark set down his coffee cup very carefully, the way I had set down my fork weeks earlier. Jenna's mouth opened slightly and nothing came out. "Board meeting?" Mark finally said. I told Daniel gently that we'd catch up another time, and he left with a puzzled look, sensing he'd stepped into something. I did not explain myself that night. I simply finished my coffee and went to bed, feeling Eleanor's presence in the room the way I sometimes did when I was about to do exactly what she would have wanted. Whatever seed of doubt that visit planted did not grow into kindness. If anything, it grew into something colder and more calculating. A week later, I overheard Mark and Jenna in the garage, their voices low but not low enough. "If he really does have money somewhere, we need to make sure the house is in our name before he does anything strange with it," Jenna was saying. "Old people make impulsive decisions. We should talk to a lawyer of our own, just in case." "He's not senile, Jenna," Mark said, though he didn't sound entirely convinced himself. "I'm not saying he's senile. I'm saying we need to protect what's ours." "What's ours?" I stood in the hallway with my hand against the wall and let those two words settle into me. Not what's fair, not what's right. What's ours, as if 31 years of my life inside those walls belonged to them, simply because they had grown tired of waiting for me to either die or disappear quietly into a beige building with bingo on Tuesdays. The next morning, I found a folded piece of paper on the kitchen counter that Jenna had forgotten to put away. It was a comparative market analysis from a local realtor, listing my house alongside 3 others that had recently sold in the neighborhood, with a handwritten note in the margin that read, "Worth asking Dad about timeline." Beside it sat a glossy brochure for Sunny Pines, the same one Mark had shown me weeks earlier, now with a sticky note on the front marked "Move-in availability, Feb." I set both papers back exactly where I found them and said nothing at dinner that night, though I noticed neither of them could quite meet my eyes. The final piece came together on a Sunday morning, when Tyler burst into the kitchen holding up his phone, practically shouting, "Grandpa, why is your name on this article?" It was a local news piece about a new pediatric wing at the Children's Hospital, funded almost entirely by an anonymous donor identified in the accompanying tax filing, by mistake on the reporter's part, as R. Callahan, listed as a former principal of Callahan Building Supply. I had funded that wing quietly 2 years earlier, shortly after Eleanor's diagnosis, because the nurses there had been kind to her in a way I never forgot. The room went completely silent. Mark took the phone from Tyler's hands and stared at it for a long time. Jenna had gone pale, and I realized, standing there in my kitchen in a flannel shirt with grease still on my hands from the garden fence, that the test Eleanor had asked me to run on our family had reached its final chapter, whether I was ready or not. I called my lawyer that same afternoon and asked him to schedule a family meeting for the following weekend. I did not tell Mark or Jenna what it was about. I only said it was time. They arrived at the meeting nervous, dressed a little too carefully, the way people dress when they suspect they are about to hear something that will change their lives. My lawyer, a steady, unhurried man named Preston, opened a folder and explained, in plain terms, what I had built and what I still owned, the remaining shares in the company, the warehouses, the investment portfolio Eleanor and I had built quietly over 4 decades of frugal living and patient decisions. In total, a sum that made Jenna's hand fly to her mouth and made Mark sit back in his chair as though the wind had been knocked out of him. Then Preston read a letter. Eleanor had written it 18 months before she passed, and she had asked that it only be read once I chose to reveal the truth to the family. To my husband, and to whoever is sitting beside him hearing this, it began. Robert has spent his whole life being underestimated by people who judged him by his hands instead of his heart. I asked him to let our children show us who they really are before any of this became about money. If you are hearing this and you treated him with love regardless of what you believed he had, then you already have everything that matters. If you did not, I hope this is the moment you finally understand what you were so busy overlooking. Nobody spoke for a long moment. Then Mark put his face in his hands, and when he lifted it again, his eyes were wet. "Dad," he said, "I told you to move into the garage." "You did," I said quietly. "I let Jenna talk about protecting what's ours, like the house wasn't already half built by your hands before I was even born. You did that too." Jenna was crying now, openly, no longer the composed woman who scrolled through paint swatches at my birthday dinner. "We didn't know," she said, "but that's not an excuse. We should have treated you like this regardless of whether you had $1 to your name." I did not raise my voice. I did not gloat, because there was nothing in me that wanted to. I simply said what I had been holding for 2 years. Your mother didn't want me to test you to punish you. She wanted me to see clearly, one last time, who would be standing beside me if I truly had nothing. And now I know. I did not disown my son. I did not disappear from their lives in some dramatic, cinematic exit. Instead, I made changes that felt right to me. I set up a direct education trust for Tyler, one that Mark and Jenna could never touch, because that boy deserved a future that didn't depend on his parents' character. I kept my house, and I told Mark, calmly, that the garage conversation was over for good. I forgave them, because carrying anger at my age felt like a luxury I no longer had time for, and because Eleanor would have wanted me to leave room for them to become better people than they had been. But I never forgot what I learned in those difficult months. Respect that only shows up once you discover what someone is worth was never respect at all. It was arithmetic wearing a kind face. My children learned that lesson the hard way, in front of a lawyer and a letter written by a woman who saw all of us more clearly than we ever saw ourselves. I still wear the same 3 flannel shirts. I still drive the old truck, though Tyler asks to ride in it now instead of hiding from it. And every Sunday, my son sits across from me at the same table where he once told me there wasn't room for me anymore, and he listens, really listens, when I speak. It took losing his mother and nearly losing his father's trust for him to understand what she had been trying to teach him all along. Some tests you never mean to give, but sometimes the people you love most only show you their true hearts when they believe nobody is watching and no reward is coming. I am grateful, in the end, that I was patient enough to wait for the truth.